Hello, everyone, and welcome to the very first CoveyLaw and Tamizdat Office Hours webinar. My name is Mars Dietz. I'm General Manager of Tamizdat, a white person in her 30s with short curly brown hair, black-rimmed circular glasses, a single earring, and a black turtleneck. This will be a monthly series, and each session will focus on one broad and timely topic related to U.S. immigration issues with an emphasis on the cultural sector. Immigration is complex, and we can't hope to provide comprehensive coverage of any topic. So this is our disclaimer. The information we provide today should not be taken as legal advice, which can only be given regarding the circumstances of a specific case. We will be giving you the best information we have right now, and you should feel free to reach out to us if you have specific questions that can't be answered now, or if you're making important decisions based on what you hear here. If you're watching this on video anytime after today, October 15th, 2025, know that information here could be outdated by the time you hear it. So again, please reach out to us for updates. If you are a CoveyLaw client, reach out to your attorney or case manager. If you're not, contact Tamizdat's pro bono hotline, Tamizdat Avail, through the sign-up form at tamizdat.org/tamizdatavail. Today, we're providing updates regarding the current visa process for international artists hoping to tour in the U.S. Joining us are two experts, Abian Gurace from the Performing Arts practice at CoveyLaw, who handles O&P petitions for hundreds of artists each year. She previously worked as an assistant district attorney in New York. And Matthew Covey, a global advocate for artist mobility, the founding partner of CoveyLaw, and a founding board member of Tamizdat, a nonprofit service and advocacy organization dedicated to international artist mobility. Given the number of people who've signed up for this session and the number of questions submitted in advance, it will not be practical to have a live Q&A. However, we hope to get through the majority of the questions submitted. This webinar is being recorded and may be made public in part or its entirety. Thanks for joining us. Matthew and Abian, take it away.
Thanks, Mars. I think Abian and I are gonna do a kind of informal back and forth. We've got a lot of questions to get through, so we're gonna kind of move quickly. Again, to reiterate what Mars just said, if you have questions after this, feel free to reach out to us and we'll do our best to answer them. My name is Matthew Covey. As Mars said, I am a middle-aged white male with a beard, scraggly hair today, and a blue turtleneck. Um, should we start with questions? I think we should just jump right in with questions, Avian. Why don't we do that?
That sounds good.
Okay, cool. So I think the thing that most of you realize is that the petition, like getting an artist visa to the US is a two-part process. There's the petition part, which is filed in the US, and once the petition is approved, then the notification of the approval goes to a US embassy somewhere in the world, and then the artist needs to go in and get the visa issued, and then they come to the US. There's a difference with Canadians who don't have to do the second part of it, but for the most part, that's what people are facing. There's a lot of stuff going on in the immigration world, and I think what a lot of the questions we received, Abian, were just about like what's happening with the petitioning process. How I think the place to start is how long is regular processing taking?
Currently, regular processing is taking over 6 months in the fastest cases we're seeing. And we are seeing cases that can take up to 10 months. There is not a guaranteed turnaround time when it comes to filing with regular. These processing times could change at any moment, but right now the estimated 7 months on the USCIS website is accurate based on what we're seeing in our cases.
Okay. Um, does it vary a lot depending on, it used to be that if it went to there's two service centers that handle these petitions. One's in Vermont, one's in California. It used to be that Vermont was really fast, California was not, or was comparatively fast. Is that still how it works, or is it changing?
We are seeing Vermont being a bit faster than California, but it seems to have reached a middle ground. Our most recent approvals at regular are about the same between Vermont and California.
Okay. Um, with a processing time of like averaging out at 7 months, I know that most of the CoveyLaw clients are choosing to go with premium processing because just like realistically in the arts, nobody's planning that far in advance, or very rarely are people planning that far in advance. So is premium processing, which you pay a bunch of extra money and theoretically you get a response in about 2 or 3 weeks, is that reliable these days? Is premium processing turning around approvals or at least RFEs within the time frame that they're supposed to?
Yes, we are seeing premium processing taking the 15 business days they guarantee. And then if an RFP is issued in your case, that does pause the premium processing clock. And once a response is received by USCIS, we are seeing um, another response from in another 15 business days. So if you use that calculation, that it is within that time frame and it
Okay.
is a reliable service.
Okay, that's interesting because I know I've seen comments online of people saying like, I don't know if premium processing is even doing what it's supposed to be doing. So it's good to hear that it is working. I mean, insofar as it makes sense to pay that much money for them to do their job, but still, at least it's if you pay all that money, it's reliable. Um, which again doesn't mean your petition is necessarily going to be approved. It just means that they will be processing it within the time that they promise. Um, so I know that they've been consolidating the processing. It used to be that if you were in the East Coast, you'd send a petition, it would go to Vermont. If you were on the west side of the country, west of the Mississippi, more or less, it would go to California. That's all changed. Can you just sort of explain what we know and what we don't know about how the processing is happening and where it's happening?
Yeah, so when you file an O or P petition, all of them are sent to a central service center in Texas where they're scanned and then sent to a service center to process. Before it seemed after in the last year, it would either go to Vermont or to California, and your receipt notice would indicate which service center was processing your case. Now, USCIS has made a change where all the petitions filed with regular processing list service center operations, SCOPS. And USCIS has indicated the reason for this is because one service center processing a case is no longer accurate. So they have put it under a general service center operations name. If you file with premium initially, you will get an e-notification that lists specifically Vermont or California. But that's not the case anymore with regular processing cases. There are ways to know if you look at your receipt notice, the envelope it came in, it usually will, you can see that it came from Vermont or from California. But it seems they're moving towards this single service center operation.
Got it. I know when we spoke with CIS officials last year, this was all their intention was that by centralizing, they would be able to make things go faster. Obviously, that hasn't really been the case. Though it is understandable how centralizing the process could theoretically make it go faster, but obviously we haven't really seen that come to fruition. Um, there's a bunch of questions that we got about the petitioning process that have to do with kind of details of it. So let's fire through some of those. There's one I think I can field here. There's one that somebody asked, how can venues advocate on behalf of their artist? I think that if by advocate what you mean is that if you're a venue and you've booked an artist and you want to know like how can I make it more likely that the artist is going to get the visa, I think participating in the petitioning process, providing documentation about the performance that you're doing and cooperating with whomever's preparing the petition is the main thing you can do. If something gets stuck, and we'll come back to this theme a lot. If something gets stuck, like if a petition gets a request for evidence or it's approved, but there's problems at the consulate for the issuing of the visa, that's the second part of the process. There's things that venues can do as the actual employer that can help in certain situations. Like, for example, reaching out to your local congressional office, senator, state representative, and asking for them to, in some situations, contact the consulate and find out what's going on. They're not going to advocate saying, CIS or the State Department needs to approve a petition or approve a visa, but they will they will often intervene and try to help you get information about that. And that's probably the most active way that venues or producers or promoters can get involved and advocate for their artists. Um, there's another question here. There's two here that are specific about changes in how petitions are being processed. One says, is a single contract between the artist and agency sufficient, or are individual signed promoter contracts absolutely required? Abian, you want to grab that one?
Yeah, it's still sufficient to provide a agreement between an agency and an artist, along with an itinerary for the petition duration you're requesting. Um, and it's also just fine to do individual contracts as well. And a little bit, it's a stronger case if it's individual contracts, but there's no problem at all to use an agency agreement.
Which is really important if you're going for a long-term visa, if you're trying to get a 3-year visa, for example, 3-year O1, and there's no way you've booked performances 2 or 3 years out, you can file a petition based on the contractual relationship between the artist and the agency, which is going to be booking that. In which case, the itinerary, we've always presented itineraries as well. This is the best good faith example of what we think is going to be happening. So it is an itinerary, but it's not a fictional itinerary. It's sort of, these are our plans. And that's still working?
Yes, that's still working. We're not seeing any pushback on the agency agreement.
Okay. Um, there's somebody who asked, and I think this question we kind of get fairly frequently. Obviously, the rules about what constitutes eligibility for an O or P visa were set up in the early 90s, late 80s, and media has changed an enormous amount since then. Um, is it still, are you finding that it's hard to come up, like, for example, music media has kind of changed enormously. There aren't the kinds of music magazines and music reviews that were available 20 or 30 years ago. Are you finding it hard to find evidence um, for, like, is it getting harder to find evidence to prove the eligibility of O and P applicants in the absence of, say, print media?
Right. So print media is one of the 6 eligibility criteria for an O or P petition. And I'm not seeing a big change when it comes to putting together an approvable petition. Um, Obviously, print media isn't what it was when the regulations were made, but there are online sources and ways to put together a case if maybe press is a weaker point for an artist or group.
Yeah, okay. So people shouldn't be fixated on print media specifically. Okay, that's good. Um, and in general, I guess there's a broader question. Are you finding that the in the petitioning process, on average, USCIS is looking for more evidence, or has that been pretty stable?
I wouldn't say they're looking for more evidence. There are times where they're questioning the evidence presented in an RFE, but not in the sense of seeking out more um,
Okay.
materials.
Yeah, an RFE is a request for evidence. So when you file a petition, sometimes they kick it back and say, like, we want more information about this or that. Are we seeing an increase in requests for evidence in the last, so, like, say, in the last year? And if so, is there any sort of pattern to what they are, what evidence they're requesting, and are we drawing conclusions about sort of policy changes that are behind those?
If we look at the last year, I would say hasn't been a significant change in the rate of RFEs being issued or a pattern that seems to necessitate change in what we're doing. It's the RFEs seem pretty normal in the course of business.
Okay, cool. That's interesting because, I think a lot of us, at least I know, I keep expecting, like, sort of the wheels to come off. And it
Right.
sounds like, at least in the petitioning, given sort of the geopolitics of the moment, it seems like, given what you're saying about the petitioning part of the process, that hasn't really, aside from the delays which lead to the necessity of premium processing, not necessity technically, but for practical purposes, sort of the necessity of paying the extra premium processing fee. It sounds like it hasn't really changed that much. Is that more or less the case?
Yeah, I would agree. I think the biggest changes come when it comes to like the logistical side. So the increase in fees, and the longer processing times are the biggest things, not so much what we're putting together in the petition or an increase in RFEs.
Yeah. As just sort of an advocacy aside here, a year or 2 years ago when they actually changed the fees, the filing fees were changed, there was so much international outrage about it. And, the all-in fee increase was like $400 or $500, in some case, like $30. And I find it sort of surprising that the fact that now regular processing just kind of doesn't work, which means everyone has to pay almost $3,000 to get their petition approved. I find it sort of surprising there hasn't been international outrage about that in the media, but um, maybe because it's not an official change, it's sort of a effective change that it sort of has gone under the radar. And so, but I do hope that that gets more coverage in the media moving forward. Um, so if a petition is approved, then that means effectively the artist has a work authorization. That the authorization to work is then communicated to a U.S. consulate or port of entry for Canadians, and then the artist has to go into the consulate to get their visa issued. Um, it used to be many years ago when I was a young man, this was a pretty much an easy process. It was sort of a rubber stamp. Once your petition was approved, you were pretty much guaranteed a visa. That is no longer at all the case. And so we're going to spend a little time going through what happens to artists who are applying for visas at their consulates. And I'm going to keep peppering you with questions, Abian, because you've really got your feet on the ground and in the trenches of this. Um, in the last year, what are we seeing in terms of like the consular process when people get their approval and they apply to go, like they set up an interview to go into a U.S. embassy somewhere, in their, what has that changed a lot in the last year?
There have been some significant changes. So the consulates hire third-party contractors to set up the websites to schedule the appointments. And so a lot of those websites have changed, and those websites are very buggy still. So there's a lot of technological issues when it comes to scheduling the interview at the consulate. And so that's been a big change that's difficult for artists to navigate. Um, I would say that's a big change. And a more recent change, there's two more recent changes, is that they have um, stopped giving interview waivers. So in the past, you could, if you had a similar visa category within a certain period of time, you could just mail in your materials and receive the visa stamp in your passport that way. And so that's no longer an option. So now more people are needing to go in person. And then another change is now you need to interview in the country of your residency or nationality. And so that's a pretty very recent change, I would say. So we're not really seeing the full impact of, what are the exceptions, but that's something to consider when you're planning where you're going to have your interview.
Yeah, that's a big problem in two ways for touring artists. One, some embassies and consulates are better than others, and I know for years, if I've got an artist who's touring in Europe and they've got to get their US visa while they're on tour, we would talk with the client, be like, hey, well, processing time is really good in Lisbon. Why don't you just add a couple days in Lisbon and you can do your interview and get your visa there, for example. And now that's not really possible anymore. It's also really a big deal. We were just talking with a client recently who's on an extended tour in Europe, and they're Australian, and they were planning to get their visa issued in Europe and then proceed to the US from there. And this is a disaster for them because this change came without warning, and now suddenly they have to figure out how to get back to Australia before they come to the US. So for touring artists, this is certainly a very big deal. When we heard about the that you could no longer get interview waivers, we were anticipating that that was going to create really long wait times for getting interviews, and possibly delays in getting passports back. Has that materialized, or are we not really seeing delays?
Right. So that change was effective the beginning of September. And as of now, we're not seeing longer wait times or wait times increasing. So that's a good sign as of now.
Cool. That's really good. So I guess that leads to the question of what, when an artist and their management are looking at the time frame for applying for a visa, um, we know that with premium processing, you're looking at probably, hopefully, assuming no request for evidence, like a 3-week processing time. You've got to figure out how long it's going to take to get the petition together at the beginning, and that's sort of how you work with your attorney or your agent. Um, how much time are we leaving for the consular processing, and does it depend on where in the world the artist is?
Yeah, so some posts just have longer wait times, so you'll want to get started in the process earlier so you're able to find an appointment that suits your timeline. But about 4 weeks is what we would say for the interview and leaving your passport to be processed.
Okay. Um, does that vary from whether you're in Europe or whether you're in Africa or whether you're in Asia or Latin America, or is it pretty consistent around the world with U.S. consulates and embassies?
The time to process, I would say, is pretty consistent, but there are challenges in terms of securing a timely appointment based
Yeah.
on the region you need to interview in. So we are seeing generally there are shorter wait times in European countries versus African countries. But there are ways to secure an emergency appointment. For instance, I had a client in Malawi need an appointment much sooner. There wasn't any available appointments till February. And last week they were able to secure an emergency appointment. That's going to be 2 weeks from today. So there are ways, even in countries where there are these longer wait times or less appointments even available.
That's really good to hear because I know that post-pandemic, um, there were enormous wait times at a lot of embassies around the world, and especially in Europe, where sort of the combination of um, refugee issues were creating huge wait times, especially in Germany and Poland, around Ukraine and Afghanistan. Um, but it's good to hear that the availability of emergency appointments is something that's still working. And I think that's really important for everybody to really realize that if you get to this point in the process, you've got an approved petition, you're applying, you're going to the embassy website to schedule an interview, and it says like nothing's available until May. Don't just throw up your hands and be like, oh, now we can't do our tour. Like, don't give up at that point. That's time to dig in. And if you need advice about how to do that, again, that's one of those places where reach out to us. Don't just sort of throw in the towel. It's just another hoop that you have to jump through. Um, in terms of what's happening at consulates, uh, are we seeing more visa denials? Are we seeing people hassled? Are we seeing the red flags that the consulates are looking for? Is that changing at all? Are we seeing, I guess being really blunt about it, I would expect from what we know that's happening at the State Department and with the administration in general, I would expect that we might see stricter enforcement or more scrutiny or more hassling coming from at embassies of visa applicants. Is that happening?
I would say if we're looking at comparing perhaps this administration to the last, we're not seeing huge changes
Yeah.
in terms of the scrutiny that people are facing. Is a bit more increase, I would say, for we've seen it in like students and towards academics. But in terms of to artists, we're not seeing a a broad policy where it seems that they're looking into them more or increasing the standards that they're putting on them.
Okay. The obvious exception to that is obviously the travel bans.
Right, right.
The proclamations that don't keep somebody from filing a petition and spending thousands of dollars getting a petition approved. But once you get that a petition, if you are from one of the travel ban countries, um, you're very likely to just simply not be approved for a visa. There is technically a an exception, a waiver that's available to the proclamation to the presidential travel bans. Under the first Trump administration, we had a lot of luck figuring out how to get those waivers. Um, it is not clear yet how available waivers are. They appear to be much harder to get this time around. We are working right now on a number of cases for artists who whose tours are impacted by travel bans, and we do not know yet whether we're going to find a way to get those get waivers for those bans. What about social media? We had a bunch of questions from people saying, are they really combing through social media looking for political activism? And I just saw in the Guardian this morning an article about um, the State Department very visibly, very, like going on X saying like we just revoked or denied visas for these 6 people because of their political statements in social media. So obviously they want us, the administration and State Department want us to think that they are going through everybody's social media and denying visas to people uh, based on the politics or the kinds of statements they're making in social media. Is that something we're actually seeing in practice with our clients?
Yeah, we haven't been seeing that in practice with our clients where that their social media is being monitored or screened before they're receiving their visa. You are required to list all your social medias on the DS-160 visa application, and there has been changes where they are requesting that, for instance, if you had a private Instagram account, that you need to make it public in order to obtain the visa. But we're not seeing them actually taking the action of looking through and taking action based on what people are posting in our clients. But there is for instance, that type of vetting is happening towards students and to academics, and that seems to be the target of these policies.
Interesting. So I think that, if artists are afraid that somebody is going to be looking through their social media, I think that fear is completely understandable, and it's clearly the fear that the State Department is trying to instill. Um, but it's also interesting that the reality is that it's not actually happening yet. It could happen tomorrow, but in terms of what we're seeing from the sampling of, hundreds of artists that we're dealing with every month, we haven't seen situations where somebody says, "Yeah, I went in for my interview and they pulled up this post I put on Instagram last week and they denied my visa." We've seen nothing like that.
No.
Um, as far as you said that compared to the prior administration, we're not seeing significant changes. That doesn't necessarily mean that everything's fine, right?
Right. There
Okay.
are problems, yes.
Okay. What kinds of red flags, where do we see artists applying for visas at embassies? They've got their petition approved and they're applying for visas and they're getting denials or they're getting delays. What kinds of situations are we seeing that happen in?
I would say the biggest one is when it comes to showing your ties to your home country. So they want to see that you are connected enough to your country that you're going to want to, or you need to come back after your visa. They don't, there, a lot of the changes that we're seeing are related to that side, which has existed in the past, but that is a red flag, is that if weaker ties to your home country. Um, I would say that's a big one. And I said earlier that we had discussed the travel ban, but another big change for um, certain countries is the changes to reciprocity. So in the past, you could have a visa for, let's say, for a 1 year visa, and that was allowed you to enter the U.S. multiple times within that 1 year period. Now they've changed it where you can only get a visa for 3 months and enter only one time. So
For
there's
for specific country, I'm sorry to
for
interrupt you.
specific countries, yep, for certain nationalities, that is like in a way to control their risk of, I would say, maybe overstay is one thing to think about. And so that's very specific to certain countries that they view as higher risk. And so that's another thing to consider um, in your application.
Yeah, and I think the thing about that, there is on the State Department a reciprocity table, and it goes country by country all around the world and says like this is how we treat applicants from Brazil. This is how we treat applicants from Norway. And there are slight variations, in some cases, significant variations, depending on the country. Um, there aren't that many countries that have significant variations, but there are some. And if you are from a country that never had a reciprocity variation, don't necessarily assume that that's the way it is now because there have been some changes. And those generally largely affect um, citizens from nations in global majority countries and in the global south. That's largely where those are happening. Um, and I think generally what you're saying, what you were saying, maybe, and about where we're seeing delays, where we're seeing concern about ties to home, that also is largely affecting our clients who are coming from the global south. Um, but I think it's important to note that by and large, that was a problem under the last few administrations, and it's more or less the same now, with the exception of the new travel bans. Um, One last thing we did a webinar a few months ago on this topic, but there's certainly we've heard a lot of concerns from trans artists who are concerned about documentation and requirements of documentation. I can say that we've handled cases for a number of trans artists in like a fair number of trans artists in the last few months, and there have been some delays while the embassy or the consulate tries to wrap their head around any sort of what are perceived as discrepancies between their original birth certificate or a subsequent birth certificate and their passport and their visa. If they perceive discrepancies, there have been some delays, but for the most part, those delays haven't been very extreme, and those visas have, I think, invariably been issued. That the artists are getting them. It's just a process of, and this is not to say it's okay. It's obviously incredibly invasive, and and to subject artists to this scrutiny is uh, offensive and clearly wrong. But the good news is at least most trans artists and non-binary artists and intersex artists that we've worked with have ended up getting their visas in the end. Again, as I said before, the fear and the concern is completely understandable and justified. Um, the reality that we're seeing in the field is that those visas are ultimately being issued. Um, I'm just scanning through questions here. I think we can move on to what's happening at the border. I think a lot of people are afraid, unless there's something else you want to touch on, Avian, before we move on.
No, we can move on. So I think now I can ask you some questions
Okay, great.
about what we're seeing at the border. And my first question is, have you seen an uptick in issues or hassles with border crossing, and anything specific to the US-Canada border?
Okay. We have, again, not for artists who are coming to the US on O and P visas, we have not seen a significant change. There have been a lot more reports of, or there have been more reports of people being asked more questions, but in terms of denials of entry, we haven't really seen any changes on that front. Um, I think we definitely have situations now where when someone is hassled, it gets a lot of media coverage. But from our perspective, and when we're hearing about these hassles and always have, it doesn't seem like it's that different. I think where we are seeing a difference and a significant change is um, where an artist is coming to the US. So there's a number of different situations where an artist can come to the US to do professionally related things, but they don't need a work visa for it. So, for example, doing an official industry showcase event. In some of those situations, they don't need a work visa. They can do that on ESTA or on a tourist visa. There are situations where an artist is coming to record where they may not need an employment visa, or they're coming to do a performance that's related to their home country's embassy and they don't need a visa. We have seen situations where artists who are coming in under those exceptions are they seem to be increasing the scrutiny, and officers at the airports are asking more questions. Um, when artists have proper invitation letters that they're carrying with them from those events or from those productions that explain the legal authority under which why they don't need an employment visa, we are not seeing artists being turned away for the most part. There have been a couple of notable exceptions to that, but there's always a couple of exceptions. So we haven't seen an uptick in problems of that sort at the border. Um, Again, sort of a broken record here. Uh, there are big problems at the border, but they're mostly affecting academics. They're mostly affecting students. We're not seeing problems affecting performing artists who are coming professionally to the US yet. Again, that could change tomorrow, but that's what we're seeing now.
Okay. And so another question here is it possible, this is a specific question, but is it possible to visit the US while you are on ESTA, but you have a pending petition with USCIS?
Yes, theoretically, yes. If you have a pending petition, you're trying to get an employment visa, the obviously because these are taking forever now, or could be taking forever now, there may be a delay, or and so during that delay, you may want to go to the US on ESTA. That is completely legal, it's completely fine. The thing to be concerned about, though, is the possibility that an officer might think you're sneaking in to work. So if you've got an O1 visa pending, a petition pending, and you want to go visit some friends, and you're a singer-songwriter, like don't travel with your guitar, because if you show up with your guitar at the airport and you're coming in, they're going to be able to see that you've got the petition processing when they process your passport. So they're going to say like, okay, you're obviously got an O1 petition processing. It hasn't been approved yet, and you're traveling with your guitar. Those are two things that both make them think, well, maybe you're coming here to work, and you may get questioned for that. So it's completely legal, but be smart about how it looks for the officers, and be a little bit careful about the possibility that they may kind of just not believe that you're not coming to work.
And so here for Canadian artists, does the process differ at all for them when it comes to obtaining an artist visa?
So the process for a Canadian is almost the same as for anybody else in the world, except for one crucial difference, and that is once the petition is approved and you have that I-797 approval notice, Canadians, in most circumstances, can just take that approval notice to the border, and they don't have to go and get a visa issued into their passport. Now, there have been some rumors recently that artists can only enter the US with the original I-797 approval notice. Artists coming in from Canada, Canadian artists coming in from Canada, can only come in with the original I-797 approval notice. This does not actually appear, there doesn't appear to be actual truth to this rumor. There have, for years, O1 artists who don't have the original approval have been subject to certain officers hassling them about not having the approval. But we've never seen someone actually denied. Um, P1 artists, which is usually meaning you're a member of an ensemble, have never been hassled because obviously there's only one approval notice, and you could have, multiple people. So having a copy of a P1 approval notice is sort of a necessity. Um, and we haven't ever seen a problem with people coming in with a copy of their I-797 approval notice for a P visa, and we haven't seen new cases where people are being hassled for that.
And so this is the next question is something that I think is getting a lot of media attention. Do artists have to submit their phone at immigration or customs upon entering, and do they need to unlock it for them to check it out?
Okay, that's a hard question to answer, and I usually just defer people to the ACLU website and say go read everything there and prepare for it. Technically, yes. Technically they do have you if they want to see your phone, they do have to you do have to submit it to them. Theoretically, you don't have to unlock it. And I think I've seen guidance that says you should disable the face recognition unlocking, the fingerprint recognition unlocking, because you theoretically don't have to provide the password so that they can go into your phone. But the flip side of that is they also don't need to admit you into the US. So if you take a strong stand with Customs and Border Protection saying, no, I'm not letting you into your phone, you're significantly increasing the chances that they're going to say, that's fine, but we're not letting you into the US. So again, we have seen very little of this in practice in the field. Very, very few reports of artists being asked to open their phone, but it has happened. Um, so uh, I guess that's sort of a make of it what you will. I do not, certainly there are people getting burner phones. There's people deleting all their social media apps. Um, all of that does theoretically reduce your risk at the border. But we are seeing enforcement so rarely that, for example, when I'm traveling across the border, granted I'm a US citizen, but when I'm traveling across the border, I am shutting off my phone and I am turning off the facial recognition, but I'm not deleting apps because I don't think that because the odds of it happening seem at this point very, very slim. Again, for the millionth time, this could change tomorrow.
Okay. And just a very specific question here. If you have a visa in your passport and you're coming to the United States and you're about to enter, do you need to pay anything extra um, upon arrival?
No. I was looking at this question, ABN, beforehand, and I'm trying to think of what this means. There's a situation, in certain situations, if you were supposed to have a visa and you don't, and you're asking for a waiver of the visa requirement, they may charge you a fee for that. I've heard rumor of there being a fee charged for somebody not having an original approval notice, but that hasn't been verified. So I don't think there's any fees that you're supposed to be getting charged at the airport when you arrive. That I, that's not a reliable. I haven't seen any reliable. There's nothing that's supposed to be charged, and I haven't seen reliable information saying that it is being charged.
Right. Okay. And this,
Uh, Go ahead.
there you go ahead.
Is it my turn? Am I taking the next?
Yes.
Okay, great. Are costs and fees increasing? We had a bunch of questions about the new visa integrity fee and whether this applies to ONP visa holders. Where does that stand, Adi?
Right. So the visa integrity fee it was signed into law and it was effective October 1st of this year. However, there hasn't been any news in terms of how this is going to be implemented, when it's going to be implemented. So it's just a big to be determined. But it does in the law, it does apply to all non-immigrant visa categories. So it would apply to ONP visa holders.
Okay. And when would that fee be applied? Do we know yet? Or I guess we don't know how it's charged.
Right. We don't know how it's going to be charged, but in theory, it's charged after they have approved the visa. To how not, we're really just not sure. Maybe when you're picking it up and you're supposed to be able to get the money back in the end, but that whole process is just unknown.
Okay. Um, so I guess so there were some fee increases with the petitioning process over a year ago. Those have sort of metabolized into the system, and I think most people know about those. The premium processing fee has gone from an option to something which is effectively necessary in most cases. The new visa integrity fee hasn't gone into effect. The DS-160, the fees that people pay at the embassy, have those changed at all?
So those have been consistent, I think for the last couple years. It there is some differences depending on which country
Right.
you're coming from, but in general it's $205 dollars that's paid per person.
Okay. But other than that, it doesn't sound like other than those significant exceptions, it doesn't sound like there's significant changes in the fees. Um,
So we can move to the next section. Are artists being targeted, and are artist visas being denied for political reasons? Is there any way of predicting how risky it is for artists who have obtained a visa to enter the United States?
right. Um, Again, I want to be careful to not suggest that everything's fine. There certainly have been some very high profile situations where, uh, Bob Vylan's visa was denied. I think there's still question about whether kneecap are going to get visas. I don't know where that stands right now, given the large amount of public media about their situation. And there obviously have been artists from Latin America who have had visas revoked because of supposed affiliations or connections to organized crime. Aside from those, we have not seen, again, we have not yet seen situations where an artist's political positions they have taken in their music, in their public persona, or in their social media have led to visa denials or deportations. Aside from, I mean, those are very significant exceptions, but for the most part, we are not seeing widespread. We're just not seeing, no, I wouldn't say widespread, we're just not seeing enforcement against artists in general. Um, so I think that again, if artists are deciding to not tour in the US because they're afraid of it, there's afraid of what could happen, totally reasonable. But unless they are extremely visible in public, then I don't think we are not seeing problems yet.
Are we seeing any feedback from artists that they are being questioned more when they're entering the country?
Again, as we talked about before, when we were talking about the border, we are not seeing significant increase or significant changes in how that's worked over how it has worked in the past. Um, we've talked about social media a fair amount. I think we can skip those questions. Is that all right with you, or is there anything?
Yeah, we can skip that and let's move on to
There was
artists
one.
that are, yeah.
Sorry, there was one in there that I just realized that is different. The question was, are petitioners, the person who's employing the artist and filing the petition on their behalf, are petitioners being searched on social media as well as the artists? I haven't seen anything about that. For years, there has been this sort of very unpredictable scrutiny of petitioners. But it's very rare that there's much scrutiny of petitioners, and we haven't seen any situation. There's no place where a petitioner has to divulge their social media. So I don't think that I don't think that the social media posts of petitioners appears to have any impact at this point.
Great. And so our next section is about artists coming here to showcase or pursuing other exceptions to the visa requirement. Are artists still entering the US on STF for showcase events?
Yeah. There's a lot of confusion about this because a lot of people continue to think, well, I'm not getting paid for this gig, so I don't need a visa, which is just emphatically not true. The US law doesn't care whether you're paid or not. If it's a professional performance, you need to have an employment-based visa, except in certain narrow circumstances. And an official industry-focused, industry-facing showcase event is at least theoretically a situation where an artist doesn't need an employment-based visa and can come in for that event alone on ESTA or with a tourist visa to make that performance. The problem is that there's no codified list of what the showcase events are. So there's always a question when an artist coming to showcase arrives is the officer going to believe that this or that event is in fact a showcase event? I would say that if you are coming to showcase in the US and you're wondering whether that event is will be considered a showcase, reach out to us because we work with a lot of the showcase events around the country and help them put together the documentation they would need to support those entries. And we can help you figure out, or even help the event figure out how to best prepare artists for coming in without a visa to do those showcase events. But based on the showcase events that have happened so far in 2025, we have not seen situations where newly artists, or where we haven't seen a change in how artists are being admitted or not admitted for showcasing events. That has remained consistent.
So this next question is from someone who is planning an international conference. They say that their participants will not be paid, and they're wondering if the artist's country of origin, for instance, from Central or South America, will have a harder time getting in. Are their instruments a red flag, and compared to, for instance, an artist coming from Europe?
Right. What's unclear about this is they said in this question, they said the artists aren't getting paid, so they don't need a visa, which may not be true. Probably not true. So the question sort of becomes if an artist needs a visa and needs an employment visa and doesn't have one, are they more likely to run into trouble or actually get caught if they're coming from somewhere other than Europe? And I think the answer to that is yeah, honestly. Um, if an artist is trying to come in under the radar, their chances of an officer saying, well, all right, fine, you're not getting paid, go ahead, if they're coming from Europe is higher than if they're coming from the global south. Um, I don't think that that's the way it has been for a long time. But I emphasize that it's not allowed in either situation. And asking an artist to come and do a performance where they do need an employment visa and they're coming in as a tourist is risky for anyone. And I think it's more risky now than it has been. We are seeing, there were times when border officers would sort of turn a blind eye and be like, well, this once, get a visa next time. And we're seeing a lot less of that. People are being they're being a lot less flexible than they used to be in their enforcement of the actual laws.
Okay. So coming back to the question of if you do need a visa, if someone is coming to speak at a convention, do they need a visa to enter? And if so, what visa do they need?
Okay, if they're coming from a country that can use ESTA, they probably don't need a visa to come and speak at a conference. If they're coming from a country that is not, where ESTA is not eligible, then they would need a tourist visa. But the rule basically says that if you are coming to the US to speak at a conference and you are not receiving payment beyond reasonable reimbursement for your expenses, then you don't need an employment visa because that doesn't count as work. Just speaking at a conference that you're attending doesn't work. For a performing artist, if you then perform, that's an entirely different matter. And then even if you're not getting paid to perform at a conference, unless it's a showcase event, then you would need an employment visa.
Okay. So for what if you're coming to do unpaid radio interviews or television appearances, can you come on ESTA?
To do an interview, yes. To do a performance, no. So if you're coming to perform live on the radio or recorded for the radio or late night television, all of those, if you're performing, as far as US law is concerned, you're rendering a service of value to that radio station or to that television station. So yes, you would need employment-based visas. Um, the television programs that feature performing artists performing live, a lot of the late night ones are very careful about this and they insist on it. Radio stations that feature artists performing on the radio or streaming them, um, it it should be emphasized that those are not allowed without an employment-based visa. I think a fair number of artists do it, but they it could create serious problems further down the line. Oh,
I think we covered this section. So
okay.
we
So I guess the big question that we keep getting asked is it risky to tour in the US right now? And that's a really, I think there's a lot of different ways to ask that because we've spent most of the last hour, Abian, saying that it's kind of not that different in practice than it has been. Does that mean it's not risky to tour in the US?
Yeah, it really, I think it just depends on the individual circumstances that you're working with. If you need to come very soon, that is a very risky situation where you're putting a lot of money into something that might not pan out in time. Um, when it comes to physically being here, there are things that are happening in this country that is different than before, and can feel more dangerous or unsafe. Um, but that's not necessarily everyone's day-to-day experience either. So it's a really hard question to answer. Um, I wouldn't say that the risk has significantly increased, but there are significant differences that is understandable why someone wouldn't want to tour here or support what's going on here right now.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that internationally there's sort of the perception that like America's on fire and descending rapidly into chaos. And that's certainly not how it feels. Although if we were in Chicago right now, it might feel differently. I do think that some artists see this as a time when it's really important to perform in the US because they want their voice to be heard and they feel like that's part of their mission. And some artists are like, there's no way I'm going there right now. Even if it's a 0.1% higher risk of something bad happening to me, whether it's at the airport or whether it's on the street, I don't want to do it. And both of those are completely reasonable responses. Um, I think that the first topic you raised, which is the financial risk, that's been a problem with touring in the US for a long time. It's a huge financial investment, and it's always a question of whether anywhere, but especially here right now, is whether that investment pays off or not. So, is it risky? Sure, definitely. Lots of guns in America. So from one point of view, yeah, it's risky to be anywhere here. Is it different than it's ever been before? In some places and for some people, yeah. But it's not as broad, it's not as widespread as I think it feels when you're not here. That doesn't feel like a very satisfying answer, does it?
No, but I feel like that's the answer we have,
Okay.
unfortunately.
We are coming up toward the last question. We've got a couple last questions here. Is there a risk from a Mexico bandit tour in the US today with a P1 visa? We sort of covered that. It's not really different than than people from other countries, I think. Um, are there any alternative visas that performers can apply for if they are affiliated with educational institutions? I'm going to answer that one. Yes, there is. There's an amazing exception to the requirement of a performance visas. It's very narrow and really complex, but it does apply when an artist is performing only at an institution of higher education. There's an exception which allows that in certain circumstances to be done on ESTA or on a visitor visa, a tourist visa. So if you are working with an artist or if you are an educational institution and you're going through the hassle of getting O and P visas and J visas and all these kinds of things for your touring artists, know about this exception and feel free to reach out to us because it's great and it works and it saves tons of money. So academic performances may be a way to avoid it. So that was that question. Are there any recent efforts to lobby for changes in the law? Absolutely, yes. Tamizdat, working with the League of American Orchestras and the Performing Artist Visa Working Group, which is a coalition of major arts organizations, have been working for years on a lot of different aspects of advocacy to try to make this process better. Um, through the Biden administration, there was significant progress and real dialogue going on with State Department and Homeland Security. That has become harder now because, for example, the CIS Ombudsman's Office seems to have ceased to exist, and a lot of the people that we have worked with in the past to make progress aren't working anymore or aren't available anymore. At the same time, however, there is a lot of talk and a lot of work being done on envisioning more broader reforms to how the artist visa process can work in the future at a time when, envisioning a time when there is comprehensive immigration reform, which remains a long-term goal of, I think, both Republicans and Democrats. So if you are interested in the advocacy side of this, please reach out to me. I can tell you about some of the efforts being done there. I think that's it. I think we're out of time, Abian. Is there anything you want to add?
No, I think that's all we have for now.
Okay. So these office hours we are going to be doing monthly. We will be uh, each office hours, we will be announcing them on social media and through email. Each one will handle different topics. This was the first one, so we kind of wanted to do a broad catch up on where stuff stands for performing artists, because that's kind of a core constituency of the people that both CoveyLaw and Tamizdat work with. But future office hours will be focusing on a variety of different topics that affect artists and creatives in terms of immigration issues. So stay tuned for information about future office hours and the topics that we'll be covering. So thank you all for coming today. We will, I believe, if this recorded properly, we will be posting it. Thanks to Mars and Harlan for helping set all this up, and thanks to Abian for being crucial to making all these answers, because you know a lot of stuff that I don't know, and that's awesome. And thank you all for coming. Have a great day.
Thank you.